Welcome to today's Truth in IT webcast. Do SMBs need archive? Today's webcast is sponsored by iMation. There's a button above the presentation labeled Questions, where you can enter your questions at any point during the presentation. We will answer those questions at the end of the webcast. Also at the end of the webcast, we will be giving away a new iPad to one lucky attendee. Our featured speaker today is W. Curtis Preston, recognized as the foremost expert in backup and recovery today. He'll give a short presentation and then be interviewed by me, Reed Robbins, after his presentation. The title of his presentation is Backup versus Archive. Curtis?
Thank you, Reed, and good morning, everyone. We're going to talk about SMBs and archive today, but before we do that, we need to sort of do a level set on this idea of what is backup and what is archive. So that's why we're doing this presentation first. So this is my definition, which is backup is a secondary copy of primary data and archive is a primary copy of secondary data. What do I mean by that? Well, backup is the other copy of the data that you actually care about, right? So it's the secondary copy of primary data. And then archive is often the only copy, sometimes the second copy, but often the only copy of data that you have that is of lesser importance. And there's a number of types of data like that. The most common is files that were created and are stored and aren't being looked at anymore. Anybody that's done any sort of SRM, and that's storage resource management, not site recovery manager for you VMware people out there, the original meaning of the term. SRM, if you've done any SRM, you know that significant portions, if not the vast majority of files that reside in any given file system are not being looked at. That no one's looked at them, and there's this high usage within the first few weeks, even within the first few days, and then after there's a cliff of drop off of activity, and then after that, the chances of a file actually being looked at in most environments goes to virtually nil. But those files still remain out there in the file system. So those files, if we can take those files, if I can identify them based on activity or some other similar parameter and then move them out to something else, that would be an archive. And that would be the most common type of archive, actually. The other type of archive is a copy of every email or file version ever sent or stored. So you can do a different type of archiving. We'll get to that in a little bit. So let's see. We have a question here about what you use for archive. So the first answer here is we use a separate archive product. In just a second, we're going to pop up a Q&A thing here. So do you use a separate archive product? Do you use the archive functionality of your backup software, or do you simply just make a backup and keep it for a really long time? So that's what we're curious if you can just pull up your screen there, pull up your mouse, and click on the votes here to just give us some idea of what your environment is doing for archiving, because this is a good level setting question for the comments that we're going to be talking about later. So I'm just going to wait here just a second. A separate archive product would be, a product that's all it does. It doesn't do backup and archive. The archive functionality of your backup software would be an actual, you don't go to the backup part of the backup software. There's actually a menu item or a command that's actually archive as opposed to backup. All right, let's take a look at our results. The results here are pretty much what I see across the country when we do our Backup Central Live seminars, because we use an electronic audience response system. And the primary answer is we make a backup and we keep it for a really long time. Actually, it looks like as additional people are voting, the answer C is getting even more popular. So the thing that I'd like you to walk away from this, although this is absolutely the most common answer, it's actually not. It's a non-answer, because we're going to talk about here that it's actually not possible in most backup products. It's not possible to make a backup and turn it into an archive. If you want to make an archive, you make an archive. If you want to make a backup, you make a backup. You can't magically turn a backup into an archive in almost every situation. So the biggest or the easiest way to determine the difference between a backup and an archive is to determine the difference between a restore and a retrieve. A restore is what you are used to doing, which is to return an entity to how it previously looked. So we delete a file or a file server, or maybe an entire volume or a database has been corrupted or damaged, and we need to return that entity to how it previously looked. Generally speaking, we're returning to how it looked yesterday, or maybe even in terms of a database, we might use transaction logs and return it to today. And we're copying data back from the same version. So we backed it up yesterday, and the version of the OS and the application that it was running yesterday is the same version it's running today, so there isn't a version issue. The recovery time objective is measured in minutes to hours, meaning that we need to do this right away. A retrieve is something very different. We're collecting information regarding a particular topic. So in terms of the one type of archive where I talked about old files that have been archived out, you're grabbing all of the files that have to do with a particular topic, not necessarily files in a given location per se, but files with a particular parameter, all of the PDF files with this word in them, or all of the drawings that are attached to a particular topic. And it can come from multiple servers, file systems, different time frames. We can, instead of recovering to a single time frame, we typically are recovering to a range where we say, retrieving a range. We are grabbing all of the files from a given range of time, or all of the emails from a range of time, such as all of the emails from Fred with the word promise in them. This is an example of an electronic discovery request for a financial trading firm that has been accused of promising financial returns or guaranteeing financial returns that they're not supposed to do. And we're coming from multiple versions of the servers over time, right? Especially if this is an electronic discovery request and we're pulling in stuff over multiple years. There could be various different versions of things. The good news is that the retrieval time objective is measured in days to weeks. This is typically done on a project basis. This isn't a critical time frame thing like backups are. This is we've received we have a new project that needs old data, so you're given days to weeks to pull this stuff in, or it's an electronic discovery request where you've got a defined time, and that's usually measured in weeks to retrieve the data. So that's the good thing about a retrieve. But it's, as you can see, this is something very different than a restore. So there's two types of archiving, as we discussed earlier. The first is what we call on-demand for space reclamation. And the idea is that we collect the files together into an archive. The easiest way to identify this is like a tar ball. Tar, oddly enough, which is used as a backup tool, is actually almost more of an archive tool. Its name is actually tape archive. Collect a bunch of files into a tar ball and call that something. You get to give it a name, right? That's one of the things that makes it an archive tool, that you can collect these files together and then give those files a collective name so that you can actually search on that name rather than the names of the files that are within there. And if you can delete the original files, right? Then the other type of archiving is real-time archiving, and the idea here is that we collect every file email version, from that's coming in and going out of a given file system or email system. This is typically done for electronic discovery or for compliance because you're required to store every version of every file or every email, and allows searching against the entire history, which is a very nice thing. By the way, to go back to the on-demand archiving, there's a very similar type of archiving, which is more closely related to HSM. I tend to call it HSM, but in this sense, it's also archiving. That's identifying. We talked about identifying files that can be moved out and put out to, if you will, put out to pasture. That's a very similar type of process, which is very similar to archiving. Backup software, generally speaking, is designed for restores, not for retrievals. There are a couple of exceptions that I'm aware of. Commvault does have the ability to collect additional data when it's doing a backup. That's part of the problem with backups, is that they don't collect the metadata that's needed. They back up the entire Exchange server. They don't grab all of the metadata for every email so that you can search against that backup, generally speaking. And they definitely don't collect it and store it in such a way that allows you to search across multiple backups. Say I'm looking for emails from Fred for the last 3 months, regardless of what backup they don't typically store data in that way. Commvault is able to do that. Backup Exec's e-discovery option, what they've done is they take the Enterprise Vault software and they stripped it down, and they've put it there in. They put a stripped down version in Backup Exec, and what it does is it will actually go in and take your Backup Exec tapes and take the data out of them that's needed to do some basic e-discovery type requests. So here we have our next question is, so for those of you that said that that you're using your backups and storing it as an archive, right? How long is that, right? Less than 1 year, 1 to 7 years, or longer than 7 years. Those of you that are infinite should, of course, answer longer than 7 years. I could hum some music if that would help. Maybe a Mexican hat dance or something.
I don't think that would help.
You don't think that would help? All right, we're going to go ahead and stop the voting here. Okay, so these numbers are exactly, it's really funny. We do these in many cities, and they almost always look like this. There is a small percentage of people that are doing less than 1 year. I'd like to say kudos to those of you that are voting A. Anyone voting B to D, in my opinion, is keeping their backups longer than they should. If you're keeping backups for longer than a year, then you need to be making archives. Those of you that are down there on D, you should be absolutely terrified. The idea of the one problem is something called the FRCP guidelines. For those of you most of you are going to be in the U.S. based on who we invited to the webinar. But if you're in the U.S., you're subject to the Federal Rules for Civil Procedures, and they basically, let me summarize what they say, paraphrasing somewhat. If you happen to have backups from 15 years ago or 25 years ago, it really doesn't matter whether it's 1 or 50 years ago. If you happen to have those backups and someone asks for them from an electronic discovery perspective, you have to provide them. And it is not acceptable to simply hand them a pile of tapes and say, here, you figure it out. You get off of them what you want. You have to return that data to them in the way it was originally stored on those tapes. But if you don't happen to have them, then of course you're not subject to that. So those of you that are in the C and D category, I would think you should be very, very scared. Even those of you in the B category, if you're storing backups, specifically backups that long, you're going to run into the version problem. You're going to run in, think about those of you that are at your company, think about, do do you even know the name of the file server where files were stored, say, 5 years ago? I'm guessing the answer is no in most cases. So, not sure what to say there. All right. So there are a couple of different places. So primarily up to this point, we've been talking about archive software and backup software. Now let's talk a little bit about the target. Most people that I know, they tend to blame the target. They tend to say, well, the reason why it's difficult to recover or to retrieve data is because we stored it on tape. And I don't necessarily, well, I don't agree with that at all, actually, because the problem isn't the tape. The problem is generally that you are storing the data in the wrong format, in a manner that does not allow for quick retrieval. Having said that, there are 3 different types of targets that are out there. I should just take the word removable. Disk is the second one. So you've got tape, disk, and optical media. Removable disk is a flavor of that disk. Tape is certainly at this point the most popular medium for archives, simply because it's cheap and reliable and stores data for a long time. Disk is becoming more of a target for archives. The one thing that you want to really make sure about here is what your disk vendor has done to handle data for long-term on disk. There are disk drives that have done additional work to be able to store data for long-term. Most disk drives have not. So if you're looking at disk for a long-term storage, just make sure that you've looked into that. I do know that the sponsor of this webinar, Imation, I know that their RDX product is an example of that type of system where they've done some additional engineering to be able to store data for a longer time. If you're interested in that, I'm sure they would be glad to talk to you about that. Optical media is a great media for long-term archiving. It's probably, if money was no object, it's probably the best of the 3. Unfortunately, money is very rarely not an object. The optical media, the comparison that I have, simply the cost of the media. UDO, by the way, is the biggest one there, and UDO media is 75 times more expensive than UDO tape, just the media itself, and that's the cheapest part of any of these systems. So it's a great art medium if you need to store something for 50 years because it's a phase change medium. It physically changes, and it doesn't have a bit rot issue at all. But it's just incredibly expensive, which rules it out for a lot of people and definitely for the SMB market. Another thing that I want to talk about just at the end here is this idea of auto-archiving file systems. This is what we used to call HSM. It's a term that's gone by the wayside for a lot of reasons, but an HSM system, what it used to be, would be typically a separate product that would be external to the file system. It would watch the file system, and then if it found files that were inactive, it would move them out to the archive and then replace it with a stub. And the problem there was always that there was that cooperation between the backup and the archive, because if you, for example, if your backup system touched the file to back it up, it would automatically recall the file, which was, could be a real mess. There are some systems today, usually they're NAS-based, that offer a scalable file system with some type of back-end scalable storage. So this can be tape, this can be removable disk, and the idea is that it allows you this sort of infinite capacity, and files that aren't being used can be archived, as I make quotes in the air, moved out to a lesser cost medium, put to the wayside, be able to be recalled if anyone, God forbid, actually asks for a file from 3 years ago that no one's touched. If they ask for it, it would be automatically brought back into the primary pool. The idea here is to create an ever-expanding file system with files that are they're stored in the primary area when they're being accessed on a regular basis, and then they're moved out to the lower cost medium when they're not being accessed. I think that's I spent time with a couple of clients yesterday, and we ended up, it's interesting, it's a solution both for smaller companies that want to save money on their storage, and it's also a big data solution where companies that have, I met with a company yesterday that has 700 terabytes of stuff, right? It happened to be research data, and a lot of it is not used, and so they're looking at an auto archiving type file system to automatically move some of that stuff out. And then you can even have these things replicate to each other, so you've got a backup and an archive built into the same thing, which is quite interesting. So now I've got to the time where I'm going to turn things back over to Reed.
Thank you, Curtis. So now it's time for me to ask you some additional questions on each of these. I'm going to actually pop back up here to some of your previous slides and ask some additional questions. So I've known you for quite a while. I'd say, I think it's around 15 years. And in that whole time that I've known you...
Don't tell people that.
What?
Don't tell people that we've known each other for 15 years.
I make you feel old. Yeah, you are kind of old. I'm not, though. So you've been talking about this difference between backup and archive for that whole time that I've known you, and telling people that they need to stop using their backups as archives. Yet, according to the survey that we just showed and the survey that we've been giving at Backup Central Live in our live seminars, here 65% of the people are still using their backups as archives. That number is actually 70% on the road. So that means that most people are still not really getting this message. Is there a reason for that? Why? This seems like a no-brainer to me. Why is it that people can't seem to accept this?
Well, that's an awful depressing question for you to start things out with. So, there's two choices. No one listens to me. That could be one. I'm not the only one with this messaging, by the way. It's a pretty common. Right. But I'd say the primary problem that I see here is inertia, right? Inertia and cost, right? So the two are assisting each other in this problem. So the backup has never been an archive as its its ugly stepsister. Right? Backup is already the ugly stepsister. Archive is like its uglier stepsister. So, you're sitting there in the meetings, right, in the budget meetings, and you're like, hey, we don't have, again, I met with a company yesterday where they're saying that, they got this giant amount of data, and this one was entertainment data, and they just know that if they actually lost this giant file system, that they would not be able to recover it in any sort of time frame. Actually, I'm sorry, the one I was thinking about, they have no backups of this particular thing because it's gotten too big for them to be able to back up it, and they just know that it's that if it died, that it would just go away, just disappear. This giant amount of intellectual property of the company, and they've brought it up in meetings, and no one still will give them money because they think they're just what was it? Was it Chicken Little? The guy screaming the sky is falling, and so they can't get money for backups, which between backup and archive, backup is the more sort of mission critical, business justifiable kind of thing, and then. So then they're also supposed to say, oh, and by the way, we also need an archive system, right? Oh, what's that? And how's that different? And I think the average executive probably has absolutely no idea the difference between backup and archive. And how much trying to get blood from a turnip? Do you want money for your backups? Or do you want money for your archives? And then backups end up getting precedent. They still have the archive requirement, and so they just end up keeping their backups for a really long time, which if they knew what I know, the executives would make a financial decision to stop that yesterday, right? Because it is a definite, major financial risk to the company to keep your backups as your archives. But, that's my best attempt to answer that question.
Yeah, I know we've had to tell a few people, I do not think that word means what you think it means when talking about this.
That's
So
right.
do you have any guidelines to help people? I mean, if I'm already using backups and keeping them for years, how would I go about moving off to an archive solution, especially if money seems so daunting about all of this?
Yeah, well, assuming that you can, well, I'd say the very first thing is to scare the crap out of senior management, right? Because you'll never make, well, not never, it's hard to make an ROI argument on archive, right? You can make sort of an efficiency argument. We can get the data off of primary cost storage, and maybe you can make an argument where you say if you have one of these like auto-archiving type file systems where you can make a cost argument, you can say, hey, if we can identify this stuff automatically and move it out there, you can make that argument. If you can really prove it, you need to prove it with hard dollars, and that's one mechanism. That's that type of archiving. But if we're talking about keeping our backups for a really long time and stopping that, the way to do that is to scare the crap out of the executives. And you do that with stories, like some of the ones that you and I know about what happens when a company keeps their backups for a really long time and then they get an electronic discovery request. And it ends up costing the company ridiculous amounts of money. And, at least in one case, I know of a major one where it was a large financial company, and they were given an electronic discovery request, and due to the inefficiency of their backup system, they actually took too long, and it resulted in the judge doing, what we call an adverse inference request, which is where the judge basically, it goes back to the days of shredding paper, where the judge basically says, look, whatever it is that the plaintiff said the defendant has on this media, just assume that it's there, because we believe that they're either hiding it or they've destroyed it. And the judge, in this case, issued that instruction to a huge lawsuit, and not only did it result in a summary judgment, a multi-billion-dollar summary judgment against the financial company, it resulted in the judge issuing what I call "you're an idiot" fine. He actually fined them. It was like $175 million because they should have known better. He just fined them just for the hell of it, and for like I don't know, wasting the court's time or something. I don't know exactly the justification that he did there, but the point was, they even came back later and said, "Oh, we found it," and he's like, "Yeah, you're an idiot. No, you're still paying."
Yeah, but that only happens to like big companies, right? I mean, only big companies get hit with that kind of judgment, right?
Yeah. So I think if you examine, case law in the United States, I think you'll find that the majority of cases are smaller cases. These big cases make the news, and they make great stories, but it's the smaller cases that are, I think, actually the bulk of case law in the United States, at least in the United States. I don't know, if we have some listeners from abroad, I can't speak to the way things are anywhere else. But here, if you've got more than one employee, then, hey, if you got one employee, then it's fine. You probably won't sue yourself, and you're probably not doing the type of business that would result in you being sued by your customers. But I'm not guaranteeing anything, right? Because if you're a smaller company, you can totally, all you need is a lawsuit big enough to have a lawyer, right? If it's a small claims type lawsuit, then, you just have, Joe Blow, and Joe Blow is not going to know to ask for your emails unless he's like me, in which case I pity the fool. But but if you're smart enough, if the plaintiff is smart enough to hire a lawyer, if they think it's a big enough deal to hire a lawyer, I think you're kidding yourselves if you think that SMBs don't get sued. And as soon as they get a lawyer, and if it's anything that they think they can prove via your electronic records, then they're going to ask for them. And if they ask for them, then you are going to be required by the FRCP guidelines to supply that data. And they're not going to accept things like, well, Your Honor, we're a small company and we couldn't afford an archive system, and so we just have, 20 years of backup tapes, right? They're just not going to accept that answer. And what will happen is you'll just end up losing the lawsuit and paying, whether you're guilty or not, because you could end up with an adverse inference instruction. That's a term, by the way, that should scare the crap out of, when we talked about earlier about how to get justification, read up on what adverse inference is, find some examples of adverse inference instructions, and explain to management what would happen if someone actually asks for stuff from your backups.
Well, let's go into another one of your examples that you can probably use to answer this next one. I've moved to the restore versus retrieve slide here.
Yeah.
If you could give me an example of how it's different to do a retrieve versus a restore from backup. So if all I have is backups and I get an e-discovery request, what all is involved with fulfilling that for my backup solution?
Yeah, well, this is one of those, Your Honor, he's leading the witness, because you and I both know the story that you want me to tell, and that is when, for the audience, Reed and I used to work at another company together, and I was a large consulting company, and they had a bank that was issued a single electronic discovery request, and they were using their backups as archives. And it was a relatively mild one by the standards that I've seen. It was, we want all the emails, with these parameters, things like all the emails from Fred for the last 3 years with these parameters, these words in it or whatever, right? And what they had was a full backup from Exchange every week for the last 3 years. Well, that's 156 backups of Exchange. In order to satisfy that one electronic discovery request, we had to do 156 alternate server restores of Exchange, run a query against that, bring up that Exchange environment, and of course, do that in such a way that, that it's not, it doesn't start sending or receiving email, which is fun, and then issue that query against that, so we start with last week, right? And we issue that query, and then we pull out a PST file for that, for the parameters that were specified. We create a PST file from last week's backup, and then we go do the backup from 2 weeks ago. We do an entire alternate server restore. We do all the stuff we talked about before. Then we do the query, create a PST file, and then we do that over and over. We did that 156 times. It took multiple servers and 15 consultants, 15 consultants for 3 months. They worked in 3 shifts of 5 around the clock and at a cost of $250 an hour, right? Because people that know Exchange and, in this case, NetBackup, don't grow on trees, and they're hard to come by, and so they can charge money like that. So, do that math, $250 an hour times 50 consultants times 3 months. And you get an idea of how huge that bill was. That's because, and of course, along those 3 years, there were different versions of Exchange, and that's what happens when you use your backup system as an archive system.
Now, we were very appreciative of that work. So
We were very, well, our company was very appreciative. I wish you and I got $1 from that, but
no, we did a lot of screaming and yelling and inventing new swear words for.
yeah.
So I have an example I can share on the other side. This wasn't an e-discovery request. This was simply, and the company that I worked for at the time did not consider this an actual archive solution. They were just thinking, okay, we're doing our backups, and we need to be able to restore from them from quite a while ago. So they regularly, at least once a month, would have a request to restore data from 3 years ago. And you can imagine how that went. I'll put you on the spot here, Curtis. You can be, you want to be the backup guy or you want to be the customer? We can walk through this conversation. You and I have had it.
Knock yourself out.
You be the backup guy. So, Curtis, I need you to restore a file from 3 years ago. What's your typical thing? Questions you're going to ask me?
Oh, yeah. Okay. I was wondering where you were going there. Okay. So, what server was that from?
I don't remember. That was 3 years ago.
So, file system name?
File system name. Well, it was either U01 or U02 or any of the ones up to U24. One of those.
And
one of those 24 file systems.
How about the name of the file?
Not sure. I mean, that was 3 years ago. I have no idea. I know it had to do with the chip design of the widget 137, and I know it had
You want
something
me to
do with that.
restore a file of unknown name and unknown file system from an unknown server from 3 years
probably had the word widget in it, maybe. It might have, somewhere in there.
Yeah, I'll get right on that.
So, and we actually got those on a monthly basis. It's a typical request. They had to have it. Now, they didn't need it immediately. They didn't need it within the next hour like most of their restore requests. They were willing to wait for it, but they had to go back to the initial design. They were supposed to keep their design of these chips for 6 years, and they might have additional things that they would go back and redo from that. And they actually expected us to find that. In most cases, we could find something or get close to it, but it would take us as long as 2 or 3 weeks to get it. Oftentimes, we would find an initial file that had to do with it, and they'd say, oh, yeah, we need these. Now I remember that's where it's at, and I need these other directories. So then we'd have to go back and request additional tapes from off-site because the first tape only had part of the stuff that we needed, and then it would request another tape. We ended up getting smart about it and requesting, let's get all the tapes for this week of area if we get it narrowed down and pull a bunch of tapes back instead of just one at a time requesting, as it tells me, well, now I need this other tape. But it was considerably more painful, and while this wasn't an e-discovery request and we weren't waiting for fines, we had engineers sitting around unable to do their work because they seemed to think that we could just type this in and narrow it right down and find it. So how would this be different if I had an archive product?
Well, if you had an actual archive product, you could do that. You can search against phrases like, in your example, you talked about, I know that it had widget somewhere in the, in the file, not in the name of the file necessarily, but in the content of the file. So you could search against content of the file, and you could search against things like metadata from emails and things like that, right? So you could easily just issue a single request that has multiple parameters, and then you just get all of the files or the emails or whatever that match those parameters, and poof, right? Going back to that giant example that I had of that bank, they could have satisfied that single electronic discovery request with a single query against an email archive system, and magic would have happened, and it would have taken hours rather than man months.
Yeah, so I think that's a key. I think people, even though we just talked about the differences, I think people still don't necessarily understand that there really is a big difference in the way that it actually functions, and that's why we used to use that phrase when we'd go out and explain this to people. I do not think that word means what you think it does. That it's not doing, it doesn't even really accomplish that. Having a backup solution doesn't go out and allow you to search for phrases or
No.
or vague assumptions. It has to know what server it came from, what file system, and otherwise you're doing a whole bunch of different searches on and getting some potential hits, and it could take you a great deal of time. So if my backup product already does archiving, you mentioned a couple backup products that do that. Am I set? Is there anything else I need to?
Well, the first is to actually use it. Because chances are most of those people that answered that they're using their backups as archives are probably not using the archive functionality of their software. So the first is to actually use that and to understand the difference between the two and to create archives. The other is to just make sure. So that's only in almost all cases, except for the Commvault and the backup exec case. In almost all cases, what that means is that you can handle the space reclamation type of archiving, which you can do either by the archive functionality of your backup software or one of the auto archiving file systems that we talked about. But if you think you possibly could have the electronic discovery email problem, that's only solvable by a product that is specifically aimed at that space.
Now, when I used Networker,
by the way, for what it's worth, sorry to interrupt you, but for what it's worth, a lot of smaller companies are using cloud-based email systems, right? There are cloud-based archiving systems. For those of you that maybe you got scared and you're thinking, "Oh, do we have to buy another product?" You could just buy another service, especially if you're actually it's irrelevant whether you're using a cloud-based archiving system. In most cases, you can use a cloud-based archiving system. It just routes all of your email through that as well, and does archiving of it.
So I think sometimes when people say they're using the archiving function that comes with their backup software, they might be, when I used to use Networker and that backup, they used to have, like there was NW Archive with Networker.
Yeah. And that's what I mean, really. But I just think that sometimes some people, they're not even actually using that.
Right. Now, but that type of archiving with Networker, that's a little bit different than the archiving that you're talking about when you do a search, isn't it?
What it is it allows you to bundle a bunch of files together into an archive and give that archive an identity, right? And say these are, you talked about widget 123. All of these files have to do with widget 123, and give them some search criteria. It's like one set of metadata for the entire archive, and then store it. And that way, when it's 5 years from now and you need all of the files for widget 123, you can search against that tiny amount of metadata that you can put there. It doesn't allow you to search against the content of the files, but it allows you to search against the metadata that you specified when you created the archive. It's like in that slide, I used the cold case analogy. It's like putting a bunch of files in a drawer, right? In Cold Case, the TV show, they have that giant room with all those boxes. It's just putting everything in one box, and then you just search by the name of the box. You can't search by the content. Give me all the bloody hammers, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So the problem I had with it is I would rarely be given a very full amount of metadata. So I would oftentimes, as the backup guy, be the one who would have to invent the metadata that I was putting on there and hope that I was putting the right stuff in there. And it didn't give me much room at that time for adding metadata. Is an actual real-time archiving product different than that? Do I still have to be the one who specifies the metadata for that?
No, the real-time products, of course, they're much more expensive too. So that you get what you pay for. A real-time product, there's file system style ones and there's email style ones. They're going to grab all that data dynamically and store it. But again, if you can identify groups of data and then automatically save them in an archive, your backup software, you're still better off than just making full backups and keeping them for a really long time, right? Because you're able to clump them together like that. But and then also with these auto archiving type file systems, because everything's still online, you can run searches against those, right? That's again a little bit better than having nothing, which is what most people have. Because most people, if you get into, by the way, the one thing about the email archiving specifically, there is a real cost savings argument that can be made there, because you can pull out, since 90% of the data in Exchange or any other email system is attachments, and 90%, as I make up two statistics right out of the air, 90% of that data is not being used. So if you can identify that data, just like files, identify emails and attachments that haven't been looked at, pull them out and put them into the archive and replace them with stub data inside Exchange, then you have saved space and storage and made backups of Exchange, which can be problematic in many environments. It made that much easier because you're backing up 10% of the size of the entire data store rather than 100%.
So you mentioned backups. Do I have to worry about backing up my real-time archiving solution? What do I do for that?
This is one of those, one of those things that we talk about, right? I think if you have a good one, you shouldn't. Of course, you give what you pay for, blah, 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 right? Well, you certainly need to have multiple copies of anything, right? So if your archiving system ensures multiple copies and ensures that those multiple copies are in multiple locations, then I would say no. But most of the time that isn't the case. And so, but like, for example, with these auto-archiving systems, so if they have history built into them, where you've got multiple versions of files, because that's the other difference between backup and archive, is that if you're not doing real-time archiving, you only have, if you're just having a file system that's storing old versions of files out on lesser cost medium, the one thing about an auto-archiving file system is that if you've got an old file and then you happen to retrieve it and then modify it and save it, well, that's the version of the file that is now saved, not the one that had been sitting there for 3 years. So if you're going to not back that up, then you need to handle the versioning part somehow. So you need to be able to go back to previous versions of the file for some period of time. So if you're handling that, if you're handling the multiple location issue, because some of these auto-archiving file systems can replicate, so you can have two of them so that they're automatically replicating to each other, and then some of them can also handle the versioning issue. If you're handling both of those, then I think you have something that is both backup and archive, and you don't have to worry about backing it up. If you don't have any one of those, then if you're missing any one of them, then then you would need to back it up.
So let's say I have archiving in place, and now I have this ability to keep my data forever. I mean, 20% of the people are still say that they're keeping their data forever. If I have some technical means of being able to do that, keep that data forever, is there any reason why I should not do that?
Well, yes. If they don't have, well, let me let me change. I think my answer is no. The question is, if they don't have a reason to keep the data for a long time, then should they keep the data for a long time? Is that what you asked me?
Right.
Okay.
If you can now keep the data forever with whatever solution you put in place, why wouldn't you do that? Why not keep it forever?
Well, again, it goes back to electronic discovery, right? It's a matter of exposure, right? So if you have if by keeping it forever, again, remember, if you have it, it's like another movie reference. If you build it, they will come. If you keep it, they will sue you. Right? If you happen to have all that data, you can get sued, and then you'll have to supply it. If supplying that data, from ages ago is not that big a chore, then I'd say, who cares? And maybe that's an SMB answer, right? But when we're talking about backup specifically, no matter how big or small, really, if you have no need, if you have no regulatory requirement to keep data for years, then don't. Create a policy, establish that policy, document the policy, document the procedure around the policy, and then document that you're following the procedure around the policy. And that's why, the policy is, backup tapes after a year are shredded or they are relabeled so that the data, we can't get to the data. They're expired and relabeled, and so if there's a backup that's older than a year, we cannot get access to it. And then prove that you do that and follow that. And that way, when you get sued and you're asked for data from 2 years ago, you can simply say, I'm sorry, it's our policy and our procedure to get rid of that data, and then you prove that you follow that policy. That is not an adverse inference situation. That is you doing your business. Adverse inference comes from when they believe that you're destroying it or hiding it after you've been sued. Shredding it beforehand is in no way, there's nothing wrong with that, unless you have a requirement to do so.
Okay, we're going to open it up to Q&A for the last few minutes that we have here. As a reminder to everyone, there's a button on the top of your screen that says Ask a Question. Go ahead and click that button and submit your questions now, and we'll answer as many as we can in the remaining time. We do have a few that have come in during the presentation, so I'm going to see if I can get through some of those. And the first one, I like this question. So, Curtis, how often do you think you should restore some data to validate the backup archive is working?
Am I allowed to say every day? That's what we did back in the day, when I was a young whippersnapper. Well, it was just the way I cut my teeth at a large bank, and we had, on average, 17 restore requests a day. We had a lot of stupid users. And then on a very regular basis, we would test our restores of our databases and things like that. There's actually some. You can actually, if you're any good at scripting, you can automate this, right? And if you're not good at scripting, then do what I've been doing lately, and that's go to Elance, right? Elance.com, and just say, hey, I need a shell script that works with, backup product X, and we'll grab a random file and, restore it to random location for, maybe you need not totally random. You want to make sure it's not too big that it wouldn't fit. But things like Exchange and things like that, you do need to do it every once in a while. And I remember getting pushback and saying, that database is really big or whatever, and we don't have space to do a restore. So what I would usually do was I would be monitoring the purchase of new equipment, and then every time a new server or a new storage array would come in, I would make the business case to let me have it for, X number of days so that I could do a restore test of, insert large database here. That's something that you might want to look into. Virtualization is also your friend here. Another friend is, because that solves at least the getting a new server problem. It also solves the problem of doing things like restoring an Exchange database and having that Exchange database start trying to send or receive mail, because you can create a virtual lab and solve that problem. And then the other solution there is there are a number of backup systems that allow you to actually now mount their backup as a primary copy, for some period of time. And if you have that, then you can test the backups of anything, anytime. Between having a virtual machine and a virtual copy of the data, you can virtually test it every day and automate it if that's what you want, regardless of the size of the data set. So I think it's, we could do a separate webinar, I think, on just, testing your backups and what you need to do there.
All right. So there's a couple questions in here that actually ask for a recommendation of a good archiving product or examples of software that do archiving to the cloud. Maybe rather than do specific archive product recommendations. What should people look for in the products?
Yeah, I mean, I get these questions all the time, when we go out on the road. Hey, what's your favorite backup product, or what's your archive product? I can answer it in a couple of funny ways. It's like, that's a billable question. It's actually not. There are a bunch of them out there, but it's actually not. It's not something that's easy to answer without knowing the requirements of the customer, right? It's not what I think is good that matters. It's what matches the requirements of the customer. And I know whoever asked that question is probably rolling their eyes right now, but that is the reality, right? Because you and I have done a lot of engagements where we go out and we talk to the customer, and the product that we like doesn't get picked, right? It happens all the time. It's what the customer, what their requirements and what their personal biases and things lead them to, right? A perfect example is there are customers, again, I met with one 2 days ago, that just hate tape, right? I'm not a tape hater, and so I may recommend a solution that has tape in it, and you don't like tape, and so you say, well, that's crap, right? There are archiving, for example, because I'm pro tape. I'm not pro tape. I'm not anti tape, right? I'm pro tape in the right situation. There are email archiving products or file system archiving products that don't have tape support, and for a large company, I don't understand that at all, right? So anyway, it really matters what I would say is there is some value. I put some in italics, some value in Gartner here, right? So Gartner does list a lot. It gives you a good idea of who the players are, and who the leaders are, and who are the ones that are really innovating. If somebody's not on Gartner's radar, it doesn't mean they're crap, but if they are on Gartner's radar, it does mean that they're making money and that they've got customers and that sort of thing.
So I want to squeeze in 2 more questions if you can give quick answers because we're almost out of time. Do you find that archive products are generally more expensive than backup products?
No, because backup products are ridiculously expensive. Backup products, archive products tend to be, in comparison to backup products, archive products tend to be one-trick ponies, right? They do one thing, right? They do Exchange, or they do Exchange and they do file system, and they only do, ext3.4. They don't do NTFS, or they don't, they do like one thing or 2 things, and that's it. Whereas backup software has to do like 57 things. You can't have a modern-day backup software that doesn't handle backing up Windows and Linux and various flavors of Unix and NetWare. There's still people that have NetWare out there. You got to have all that. You got to do Oracle and SQL Server and Exchange and Lotus Notes and all of these other things. It almost doesn't matter what the market share. Well, it matters somewhat, but I watched there was a backup product, a major backup product that announced new support for Sybase the other day, and I was surprised because I hardly ever hear of Sybase anymore, but they added support for Sybase. These are the kind of things that the backup product has to do, and unfortunately that comes with a lot of cost. Archive software, by contrast, does 1 or 2 things, and they handle limited areas of functionality. And they know that they're the ugly stepsister, and so they are really good at coming up with cost justification, ROI type stuff, where you can't do an ROI on backup software.
If you can give just a really 30-second answer to the last one, I just want to squeeze in. Somebody asked if you have experience with LTO5 as LTFS and if that works as an archive solution.
I think that it works as that's on my list of tape. When I listed tape as a destination, I think LTFS is a wonderful idea, and it's getting a lot of traction in the media and entertainment space. And the answer is yes, I have direct access with that. We actually have an LTFS archive solution here, and I love the idea. Don't expect this performance, but it does act like a file system, which I think is great.
All right, so that's all we have time for. We're actually squeezing out a little bit overtime here. So as a reminder, today's webcast has been sponsored by iMation. I have their slide up here now. You can visit their website, scalablestorage.com, to get additional information. We'd like to thank everyone for attending. We have chosen a winner out of our attendees to win an iPad 3. And if you weren't the winner today, check out our upcoming webinars at truebit.tv. You can also go to any of the following websites here that are ours. TrueBit TV will give you additional webinars and videos that you can watch. BackupCentral.com gives you general information on backup and recovery and contains all the forms for the major backup products. And you can also go to truthitit.com to get information on our upcoming live seminars. And again, thank you everyone for attending. And that will do it for today.